Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And tonight, delving into a little bit of World War II era history, also has to do with Oxon Hill, where I grew up, and a place called Oxon Hill Manor, which is very familiar to George Webb and George Webb fans, because that's where George and I did a lot of our work a couple years ago. And so Oxon Hill Manor is right next to and up the hill from National Harbor. In fact, National Harbor was made on land that formerly was part of Oxon Hill Manor. Oxon Hill was a real a plantation in essence. They didn't call them plantations in old Maryland, but they called them manors, and this was a manor. But this house that you're seeing there, and Andy's with us tonight. Thanks, Andy, for producing from your road trip down to Texas. But that is the mansion that was built for Sumner Welles. And Sumner Welles is the subject of our show tonight. Andy, you got a picture of Sumner Welles we can show the people. And there we go. Let's just look a little bit into who he is, because he owns Oxon Hill Manor, and he in fact built that, or it was built at his expense, because he is from the old families of New England. He's got money, and he is one of the establishment types that we can actually identify as a white hat, believe it or not. But of course, he had to meet his destiny in in shame because of his sexuality. But let's not get hung up on that. Let's look at his real policies and contributions in trying to avoid World War II. A gentleman, therefore, of the old elite, but somebody who I think is worthy of our attention. Let's go back to the top, and I want to read a little bit about Sumner Welles. He was an American government official and diplomat in the Foreign Service. He was a major foreign policy advisor to President Franklin D. Roosevelt and served as Undersecretary of State from 1936 to 1943 during Roosevelt's presidency. Born in New York City to a wealthy, well-connected political family, Welles graduated from Harvard College in 1914. He entered the Foreign Service at the advice of Franklin Roosevelt, who was a family friend. Welles was excited by Wilson's ideas about how American principles could reorder the international system based on liberal democracy, free trade capitalism, international law, a League of Nations, and an end to colonialisms. Um, well, let's leave that document now, and let me show you a book that I have, which I find to be just one of those amazing things that happens in life. This book is called Sumner Welles, FDR's Global Strategist, a biography by Benjamin Welles, and Benjamin Welles is his son. And so, like me, this man felt that his father needed a biography, and he wrote a tremendous biography. This is 300 and 400 pages with footnotes. And I think it's something I need to read one day. I have not read it, but I did buy it. Let's see if I made a note of when I bought it. I used to write dates in there, but when I found this book, I said, I need this book because of Oxon Hill and my own personal interest and connections to Oxon Hill, which goes back a long, long way. And in fact, my first marriage occurred at Oxon Hill Manor. So it gives me pleasure to pull this book out, which I bought years ago, and find it useful now. Let's read a little bit from this book written by his son, Benjamin Welles. And it's about his trip to Rome in 1939 as a kind of a last-ditch effort to see if the United States could stop this war that has gotten started in Europe. So Franklin Roosevelt sends Sumner Welles to Rome and also to Berlin to talk to Mussolini and Hitler and see what their attitude is toward possibly not going to war. Welles, this is page 246. Welles sailed in a blaze of publicity for Naples on the Italian liner Rex on February 17th, carrying in his briefcase a numbered code for direct communications with the president, and accompanied by J. Pierpont Moffat, chief of the department's European division, and the usual large family entourage, Matilda, her young cousin, and traveling companion, Tora Ronalds, and their maids, Reeks and Wells's West Highland Terrier, Toby. The presence aboard ship of Myron Taylor en route to his Vatican post aroused further speculation about the United States Vatican peace moves among the many reporters assigned to cover Wells's trip. Wells confined himself to the bromides about the weather and was wryly amused about the sobriquet Sumner the Silent that they fastened upon him. At Naples, Mussolini's officials had rolled out a huge red carpet, and a special train stood waiting to take Welles and his party to Rome. All seemed off to a good start, except that Toby calmly lifted his leg on a ceremonial urn during the welcoming ceremonies, embarrassing Reeks, who was holding his leash, and Welles, who looked stonily the other way. In Rome, Welles found Mussolini's 37-year-old son-in-law and foreign minister, Galeazzo Ciano, more intelligent and sympathetic than his playboy reputation had suggested. Ciano spoke colloquial English, was cordial and unaffected, and made no secret of his contempt for France and Britain, nor of his respect for German military power. He detested Hitler, and even more, Joachim von Ribbentrop, his foreign minister, and told Welles that Hitler might have accepted peace after his conquest of Poland, but now it was too late. Ciano, along with the Axis officials with whom Welles would meet in the coming weeks, made clear without subterfuge or hesitation that he opposed the war, saw devastation for Europe if it spread, and intended by every means at his disposal to prevent Italy's entry into the war. Sensing a covert ally, Welles emphasized the advantage to Italy in remaining neutral. Dangling the prospect of greater trade, Welles noted that the United States and Latin America together formed one great neutral influence in the world. Italy should work with it to lay the groundwork for peace. Ciano confided soon after to the famous red diary locked in his safe that Welles was a gentleman compared with high German officials who were presumptuous barbarians. Welles, quote, easily bore the weight of the mission which had thrust him into the world limelight. I did not hesitate to inform him about events concerning which he was not informed. He seemed pleased when I let him know my feelings and sympathies. Dissimilar as they were, Welles, a towering, reserved Anglo-Saxon, Ciano, a chubby, ebullient Latin, their common interest in halting the war seemed at least to Welles to have forged a bond. Nevertheless, he wrote to FDR later that Ciano, although sympathetic, was also wholly subservient to his formidable father-in-law and quailed when confronted with the Duce's wrath. The next day, accompanied by Ciano and Ambassador Phillips, Welles had his first interview with Mussolini. The Duce, he wrote FDR, was ponderous, moving with an elephantine motion, his face falling in rolls of flesh. He seemed to be laboring under some tremendous strain, physical unquestionably, for he has procured a new and young Italian mistress only 10 days ago, but mental as well. One could almost sense a leaden oppression. Mussolini had reason for oppression. Unknown to Welles, he was due to meet Hitler at the Brenner Pass in a few days. and suspected that the Fuhrer would demand his immediate entry into the war. Wells asked if a basis for peace still existed. A negotiated peace was still possible, replied Mussolini, but not if the war spread. Citing Italy's territorial claims and its ties to Germany, he hinted at the terms Hitler might demand in return for peace. The Allies, he warned, were underestimating Hitler's military power. On arriving, Wells had presented Mussolini a handwritten letter from FDR emphasizing his hopes that Italy would remain neutral and concluding cordially, I still hope to meet you one day soon. Mussolini expressed pleasure, but demurred at the distance. When Wells suggested the Azores as a possible halfway point, Mussolini seemed to toy with the idea, promising to reply to FDR personally. He never did. Long after, Wells would write that a Roosevelt-Mussolini meeting, quote, probably would have spared the Italian people the tragedy which they have undergone, unquote. Giano's private analysis of Wells's interview with Mussolini was somber. The meeting, he wrote in his diary, had been icy. Wells had left the Duce's vast, dimly lit study more depressed than when he entered it. On the other hand, Ambassador Philip's wife, Caroline, presumably echoing her husband, thought that it had been a great success. The ambassador had never seen the Italian dictator more amiable and friendly. Wells, she mused, was a strange man, tall, handsome, distinguished looking, essentially a gentleman, cold, reserved, stoical, and very able. Well, he travels then to Berlin, and I think it's worth recounting his meetings with some of the top Nazis. Wells's opening interview with Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop on March the 1st was one of the, quote, most unpleasant in his life, he wrote later. Accompanied by Alexander Kirk, whom Ribbentrop previously had refused to receive, Wells entered the foreign ministry past stormtroopers in, quote, stained uniforms, their faces subnormal in their startling brutality, unquote. Ribbentrop lectured Wells for 2 hours, his arms extending along the sides of his chair and his eyes closed like a Delphic oracle. His mind was, quote, completely closed. The man is saturated with hate for England, Wells wrote to FDR. He is clearly without background in international affairs and was guilty of 100 inaccuracies in his presentation of German policy during recent years. I have rarely seen a man I disliked more. The following morning at 11, Hitler received Wells pleasantly but with great formality. He was taller than expected and had none of the ludicrous features often shown in his photographs. He seemed in excellent physical condition. His color was good, and his eyes, while tired, were clear. He was dignified, spoke with clarity and precision, and Wells, who understood German, followed every word, though the interpreter, Dr. Paul Schmidt, interpreted at times inaccurately. Hitler's voice was low and well modulated. Only once during the hour-and-a-half conversation did it take on the raucous stridency heard in his speeches. Only then, wrote Wells, did his features lose their composure. Wells had opened with a short statement. He brought no proposals. His mission was simply to learn the purpose of the German government so that Roosevelt might judge for himself whether a just, durable peace was still possible. Hitler then launched into a 90-minute diatribe. He had sought peace with Britain unsuccessfully, he claimed. So long as Britain and France intended to destroy the Reich, there was no hope of peace. Wells and Kirk left, escorted by uniformed Nazi guards marching in measured tread past bowing servitors in blue Latin livery and powdered hair. It was tragically plain, Wells reflected as he drove away, that all the decisions had already been made. The best that could be hoped for was delay. Wells's next interview with Hermann Goering, Hitler's deputy, was memorable. Despite the freezing March weather, Goering sent an open limousine to drive Wells an hour across the North German plain to his residence. Karinhal, an ornate palace built around a former hunting lodge. Throughout the drive, snow whirled past flapping canvas curtains into Wells's face. Goering's girth was monstrous, his thighs and arms tremendous, Wells wrote to FDR. His hands were shaped like the digging paws of a badger. On his right hand, he wore an enormous ring set with 6 huge diamonds, and on his left, an emerald an inch square. His face gave the impression of having been, quote, heavily rouged. But since at the end of our 3-hour conversation the color had vanished, Wells added, the effect was probably due to some form of physical maladjustment. Goering was more frank and cordial than the other Nazi leaders, but his account of German history over the past 7 years parroted Hitler's. Germany's armed strength vis-a-vis the Allies was far greater than in 1914, he boasted. The Luftwaffe was supreme. The war would be short, Germany victorious, and even if the war lasted 5 or 10 years, Germany would grow steadily stronger and emerge triumphant. Listening in a low, easy chair by the fire as the snow gusted outside, Wells reflected that Goering had at least traveled outside Germany and had some concept of foreign psychology. He alone in Hitler's entourage might grasp the impact of a German war on the American people. War would inevitably affect America's vital interests, Wells warned, but Goering brushed it aside. Britain and France were determined to crush Germany, he insisted. War was inevitable. If the United States could prevent it, it would be the greatest thing which human beings could desire. The United States should feel no cause for alarm, concluded Goering. Germany had no ambitions that could affect the Western Hemisphere. Better informed about Axis penetration in Latin America than anyone except Roosevelt, Wells knew that statement for the lie it was. His interviews with other Nazi officials were equally sinister. Rudolf Hess, a deputy Führer, seemed of the lowest order of intelligence. Forehead low and narrow, deep-set eyes very close together, he reported. Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, Wells's opposite number at the Foreign Ministry, drew their chairs to the center of the office to foil the microphones in the walls. Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's fiscal wizard, whispered to Wells at Kirk's house that he would be dead within a week if what he was about to relate was repeated. He then confided a plot by unidentified German generals to oust Hitler and pleaded with Wells to be allowed to visit the United States, presumably to further the plot. German atrocities in Poland, he confided, were beyond imagination. On his last night, walking across the snow-covered Paris airplatz to the Adlon Hotel where he was staying, Wells paused to chat in German with four old country women, encumbered with heavy bags and satchels, who had stopped to rest. Dressed in the long, heavy skirts and tight corsets of an earlier era, they had the decent, kindly faces he remembered from his childhood visits to Germany. What struck him most was that one had already lost 3 sons, and the others 1 each, in the Polish campaign 6 months earlier. Wells left Germany the next day, profoundly depressed. What influence Mussolini had ever had on Hitler was gone. The key to war or peace now lay solely in Berlin. Well, he then goes to visit Ambassador Joe Kennedy, who he meets on a train. Of course, that's the father of President John F. Kennedy. There's so many interesting stories in here, but now I want to turn to this other book that I've been focusing on lately. This is Trading with the Enemy by Charles Higham. And now let's refer to the references to Sumner Welles in here. So just to refresh from the last Mindfields in which I introduced this book, the author Charles Higham uses the term the fraternity, and he wrote this book in 1983. So although other people haven't adopted his term the fraternity, what it means is pretty clear. It is kind of the deep state of the time, and we have in his preface he explains what he's talking about. It came as a severe shock to learn that several of the greatest American corporate leaders were in league with Nazi corporations before and after Pearl Harbor, including I.G. Farben, the colossal Nazi industrial trust that created Auschwitz. Those leaders interlocked through an association I have dubbed the Fraternity. Each of these business leaders was entangled with the others through interlocking directorates or financial sources. All were represented international by the National City Bank or by the Chase National Bank and by the Nazi attorneys Gerhard Westrick and Dr. Heinrich Albert. All had connections to that crucial Nazi economist Emil Pohl of Hitler's Reichsbank and the Bank for International Settlements. The tycoons were linked by an ideology, the ideology of business as usual. Bound by identical reactionary ideas, the members sought a common future in fascist domination, regardless of which world leader might further that ambition. Let's, there you go. Thanks, Andy. That's good. So let's think about that for a second, okay? Regardless of which leader, of which world leader might further that ambition. So this is a new way that I am seeing World War II now. I want to explain what I'm saying here. We have looked at World War II, as the inevitable outcome of World War I, where they had the Versailles Treaty and they imposed the impossible terms on the Germans, and the Germans resented it, and they were desperate, and so that in desperation they turned to the insane leadership of Adolf Hitler and threw themselves into the crazy Nazi movement as if that just came up out of nowhere. Standard history would tell us, that this is just an example of pure evil that arises from time to time in the world, in the picture of a Hitler or a Stalin or an Idi Amin or anybody else that you would like to name as a genocidal maniac. That's pure evil, and that's as far as you have to think about it, right? That's it. End of story. Close the book. No, that's not good enough analysis. What's really going on here? Look at the money. Think about what we just read. These are tycoons from Europe, America, perhaps other places in the world, but in World War II, essentially, we're talking about rich people in corporate sense of wealth, and all of these interlocking directorates from I.G. Farben to Standard Oil to IT&T to Texaco, which we haven't talked about yet, but it's a big subject of this book. All of these connections have created something that's almost alive, and that is this corporate monster that has no soul, like a golem, a creature that doesn't have a spirit, it doesn't have a soul, but it exists, and it exists because governments created these corporations, and now the corporations have got so much power that they can rule over the governments. And so where I'm getting to with this is that World War II and World War One, I would submit also, were not really about, nationalism or racism or, as horrible that part of it is. It's about business as usual, the religion of business as usual, so that these folks see nothing wrong with a Walter Teagle of Standard Oil, New Jersey, saying, we have a lock on all the resources needed by the United States to fight the war. It's not just the oil, it's also the rubber, it's also the shipping, it's also the trains, it's everything. They've got all of the means that we need to fight the war. They can control it through Standard Oil and its related companies and foundations, and they can control it. So, with that much power, they can force the United States to allow them to keep doing business with our enemies. And that is the overall theme of this book, Trading with the Enemy, is that, yeah, this was the time right now in 1940, 1939, 40, 41, while Sumner Welles is active as the Undersecretary of State, managing the foreign affairs under Cordell Hull. But as we read in the biography, Cordell Hull had basically turned it all over to Sumner Welles. So this is a very much more important man than history would tell us. Now, on page 39 of the book, Trading with the Enemy, on March 31st, 1941, Sumner Welles of the State Department stepped into the picture with a detailed report on refueling stations in Mexico and Central America that were suspected of furnishing oil to Italian or German merchant vessels now in port. Among those suspected of fueling enemy ships were Standard Oil of New Jersey and California. There is no record of any action being taken on this matter. So Sumner Welles is aware that Standard Oil is doing business in Mexico with companies that are going to resell it or transport it to Italy and Germany. In March of 1941, at a time when they're already sinking our ships with their submarines, and not long before we enter the war. Clearly, a questionable standard, questionable practice, and one which ends up getting Americans killed. There's a whole chapter on the Mexican connection, which is uh, quite interesting to those of you that are interested in World War II and the Nazis there, and how J. Edgar Hoover had basically caught a lot of this activity that's going on between American corporations and the Nazis. The next chapter, called "Trickery in Texas," brings us to the company called the Texas Company. And the Texas Company was the forerunner of Texaco. You can trust the man. You can trust your car to the man who wears the star, the big, bright Texaco star. And that is Texas Company, the Texas Company. Torkild Cap Reber of the Texas Company was an important link to the fraternity. Born in Norway in 1882, this strapping young Viking became an American citizen at the age of 22. Within weeks, he was master of an oil tanker, loading up from Spindletop, Texas. He joined the Texas Company at 23. Within 20 years, he was chairman He created a tanker fleet that gave his company enormous international power by 1933. He built the Barco pipeline in Colombia, flying suspension bridges in sections from Texas to the Andes, flinging them across 5,000-foot passes. He linked up with Standard Oil of California in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, obtaining a monopoly through under the table deals with the local rulers and the Japanese and German interests in those areas. Cap Reber supplied Franco in the Spanish Civil War, shipping oil from Galveston to Bordeaux in France and then to Corunna, with orders not to stop for inspection by any man of war, including United States gunships. He supplied polymerization techniques to IG Farben in the Ruhr and to IG Farben connected companies in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria, with the approval of the State Department. In December 1939, he flew with Goering in a plane piloted by Pan American Airways pilot Pete Clausen on a personally conducted tour of the main centers of industrial Germany. He sailed his vessels through the British blockade to fuel the U-boats after 1939 and simultaneously sent more aid to Nazi corporations in South America. He told Life magazine in 1940, quote, "If the Germans ever catch any of my ships carrying oil to the Allies, they will have my hearty permission to fire a torpedo into her." In 1940, Reber worked in close collaboration with the Texas company's German representative, Nikolaus Benzmann, who was a paid spy of Hermann Schmitz's nephew, Max Illner, in Bremen. Benzmann corresponded with Reber and Reber's vice president, Dearborn, in a complicated cipher that was successfully designed to evade the British censorship. By the code, Reber was able to send information to Benzmann about gasoline shipments to the Canary Islands and secret patents being secretly supplied clandestinely to Berlin. In 1940, Reber sold all the German interests in Texas company's German patents for $5 million. He arranged contracts with IG Farben in which he supplied the plans of all the motors and installations of American Navy yards and Army forts that he provided with gasoline and oil. The visit to New York that year of Nazi fraternity associate Gerhard Westrick exposed Reber to such unwanted publicity that several shareholders in the Texas company demanded that there be a house cleaning. And I just skip forward. As a result of that, the Nazi business was transferred to a new company called Caltex. And Caltex jointly bought up millions of dollars worth of oil from the Arabian Sea. The banker was James V. Forrestal, a man who enters into our story in many ways later on. Of the board, he was a board member of the Nazi General Aniline and Film, GAF, and who was about to become the Undersecretary of the Navy. Saudi Arabia had intricate economic and political links with Hitler. It was agreed throughout Europe when Hitler received Khalid al-Hud at the Berghof that it was a blow to Great Britain. It was a result of Walter Funk's Reichsbank giving Ibn Saud a credit of 1.5 million Reichsmarks from Hitler's personal treasury for the purchase of 8,000 rifles, 8 million rounds of ammunition, light anti-aircraft guns, armored cars, a special Mercedes for the king, and the buildings for a munitions factory. Soon afterward, Emil Pool arranged a further loan. These arrangements were in effect in 1941 when the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the leading legalist of the Arab kingdoms and among the bitterest enemies of the Jews, met with the Führer in Berlin. Well, the story is a little too complicated to tell all of it in a little bit of time that we have here tonight, but I wanted to just give you the idea that this Texas company was doing business with Nazis as well as was Standard Oil. And I haven't even gotten to the telephone plot yet. So let's move forward to, well, let's talk about the Sumner Wells on page 85. Okay, so Harold Ikes, who we mentioned, or Ix, who we mentioned in the last show, is opposed to all of these oil company deals with the Nazis, of course, and with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was living in Rome and was working with Kurt von Schroeder's banking friends and the ambassador Franz von Papen in Turkey. All of this stuff is going on involving American corporations in Nazi and Nazi controlled areas during World War II. And this book is just astonishing in that it explained it all in 1984. And yet still people, we don't study it in a school. We don't give this information to folks, and it's important. How was this possible? Because Caltex and Aramco, which is the Saudi oil company, still had plants in the State Department. What grievous situation existed in the State Department that allowed such infiltration? The elements of anti Semitism and secret sympathy for the Nazis' form of government had been there since the early 1930s. In the department's uncomfortable, crowded, and antiquated building, there were daily collisions between the embattled liberal faction and the right wing extremists. Behind the scenes as ambassador at large, William Bullitt was the prime schemer in assuring that the extreme right wing in the department retained a sophisticated neutralism in time of war. He set out to remove the single most powerful force against world fascism, Sumner Welles. Welles was a strong opponent of the fraternity's deals with Saudi Arabia and South America. Intelligence reports told him how deeply Hitler had penetrated Saudi Arabia, that Ibn Saud was one with Hitler despite Arabia's phony breaking off of relations with the Axis, a sop to the public, and that much of the investment of the American government in pipelines on behalf of Caltex Aramco would go straight into enemy hands. Isn't that familiar? You know, here we are, we're building a pipeline for Caltex because we like to help our American corporations, right? But Caltex is building the pipeline so that oil from Saudi Arabia can go to the Nazis. Business as usual, you know? It's all about how much money can I make. It doesn't matter how you make it. That is the philosophy of this insane entity, the corporate octopus, or the incredible web. It's like the worst spider web that you could get caught in. How do you could possibly get out of it? They're all of them interlocked. Intelligence reports told Sumner Welles how deeply Hitler had penetrated Saudi Arabia, that Ibn Saud was at one with Hitler. He was opposed to the arrangement with Vichy because he believed that in propping up Marshal Pétain's regime, the United States was allowing its gates to be left wide open to Hitler's commercial, political, and espionage agents. Welles's personality was cold, authoritative, and detached. Tall, elegant, and flawlessly tailored, he came from the top of the East Coast establishment. Wealthy in his own right, a career diplomat from the first, he had been at school with Roosevelt at Groton and frequently entertained Franklin and Eleanor in his exquisite house at Oxon Hill. His wife was socially prominent, and he had a growing family. Despite his strongly liberal stance, he was acceptable to the establishment because he seemed to represent the finest virtues of the ruling class. Yet he had a weakness. He was bisexual. At night, this pillar of the Washington community would disappear from his house on the excuse of working late, and in disguise, make his way into parks, toilets, and places of assignation and perform intercourse with blacks. He presumably paid for sex because he was afraid that a genuine affair would expose him. William Bullitt had long heard rumors about Welles. When Welles was ambassador to Cuba, there had been talk of relationships with young Cuban boys. Welles had left the Caribbean under a heavy cloud. Roosevelt had chosen to ignore the stories. Bullitt had gone to see J. Edgar Hoover in 1940 after his return from Paris and asked him to investigate Welles. Hoover, who was himself alleged to be a homosexual, knew of all the secret places where the homosexual community met. He decided to act at once. On September 16, 1940, a solemn funeral was held in the chamber of the House for the beloved Speaker William Bankhead. Two special trains left Washington for Jasper, Alabama for the burial. On the homebound train were Roosevelt and virtually his entire cabinet, including Welles. As the train chugged into the night, two Pullman porters Hoover had hired went into Welles's bedroom. They first flirted with him and then blatantly offered themselves for a price of $100. Welles, who was drunk, seemed to ignore the fact that the president, the attorney general, Harold Ickes, and practically everybody in the government was in the same car. Hoover had his men stationed in the adjoining bedroom. Welles's drunken conversation and the sexual acts that followed it were noted down. Bullitt and Hoover spent the next 3 years amassing a thick dossier on Welles. Pa Watson, secretary to the president, was in charge of the investigation. Bullitt absurdly charged that Welles's wife was having an affair with a Russian spy, and that Welles was being blackmailed by communists to leak state secrets to Russia. Well, the story goes on, but you get the idea. His enemies had enough to force him to resign. But I've still got 10 minutes to tell you a little bit about the telephone plot, which is chapter 6 of the book. So, again, this is another example of American corporations that are just astonishingly willing to do business with the enemy, selling them war materials that will kill American kids. And we need to know this because it's part of our history and how we got to where we are today. During the early days of 1942, Carl Lindemann, the Rockefeller Standard Oil representative in Berlin, held a series of urgent meetings with two directors of the American International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, Walter Schellenberg, the head of the Gestapo's counterintelligence service, the SD, and Baron Kurt von Schroeder of the BIS and the Stein Bank. The result of those meetings was that Gerhard Westrick, the crippled boss of ITT in Nazi Germany, got aboard an ITT Focke-Wulf bomber and flew to Madrid for a meeting in March with Sosthenes Bain, American ITT chief. In the sumptuous royal suite of Madrid's Ritz Hotel, the tall, sharp-faced Bain and the heavily limping Westrick sat down for lunch to discuss how best they could improve ITT's links with the Gestapo and its improvement of the whole Nazi system of telephones, teleprinters, aircraft intercoms, submarine and ship phones, electric buoys, alarm systems, radio and radar parts, and fuses for artillery shells, as well as the Focke-Wulf bombers that were taking thousands of American lives. Sosthenes Bain, whose first name was Greek for life strength, was born in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands on January 30th, 1882. His father was Danish and his mother French Italian. He and his brother Hernand, later his partner, were schooled in Corsica and Paris. In 1906, Bain and his brother took over a sugar business in Puerto Rico and snapped up a small and primitive local telephone company. Realizing the potential of the newfangled telephone, Bain began to buy up more companies in the Caribbean. He became a U.S. citizen. In World War I, Bain served in the Signal Corps as Chief of Staff for General George Russell. He learned a great deal about military communication systems, and his services to France earned him the Légion d'honneur. Back in the United States, Bain became associated with AT&T, of which Winthrop Aldrich was later a director. In 1920, Bain's work in the field of cables enabled him to set up the IT&T Corporation with $6 million paid in capital. Gradually, he spun out a web of communications that ran worldwide. He soon became the telephone king of the world, making deals with AT&T and JP Morgan that resulted in his running the entire telephone system of Spain by 1923. His Spanish chairman was the Duke of Alba, later a major supporter of Franco and Hitler. In 1930, Bain obtained the Romanian telephone industry, to which he later added the Hungarian, German, and Swedish corporations. By 1931, his empire was worth over $64 million despite the Wall Street crash. He became a director of, inevitably, the National City Bank, which financed him along with the Morgans. Bain was aided by fascist governments, into which he rapidly interlocked his system by assuring politicians promising places on his boards. He ran his empire from 67 Broad Street, New York City. His office was decorated with Louis XIV antiques, rich carpets, and portraits of Pope Pius XI and various heads of fascist states. He traveled frequently to Germany to confer with his Nazi directors Kurt von Schroeder and Gerhard Westrick. On August 4th, 1933, he and his representative in Germany, Henry Mann of the National City Bank, had a meeting with Hitler that established a political relationship with Germany that continued until the end of World War II. The Fuhrer promised aid and protection always. Through Mann, Bain was connected with Wilhelm Kepler, who formed the circle of friends of the Gestapo and introduced him to Schroeder and Westrick. Not only did Kepler, Schroeder, and Himmler see to it that Bain's German funds and industries were untouched by forfeit or seizure, but Schroeder arranged for Emil Pool at the Reichsbank to pay off ITT's debts. Bain became an important aide to his friend Hermann Goering. In 1938, he and Schroeder obtained 28% of the Focke-Wulf Company. They greatly improved this deadly bomber squadrons that later attacked London and American ships and troops. When Austria fell in 1938, Bain organized his Austrian company under the management of Schroeder and Westrick and aided in the expulsion of the Jews. Some Nazis tried to take over the Austrian offices, but Bain again visited Hitler at Berchtesgaden and made sure that IT&T would be allowed to continue in business. When Hitler invaded Poland, Bain and Schroeder conferred with the German alien property custodian, Hans-Joachim Caesar. The result was that the ITT Polish companies were protected from seizure for the duration. Another protector of Bain's in Germany was ITT's colorful corporation chairman, Gerhard Westrick. Westrick was a skilled company lawyer, the German counterpart and associate of John Foster Dulles. Westrick's partner until 1938, the equally brilliant Dr. Heinrich Albert, was head of Ford in Germany until 1945. Both were critically important to the fraternity. On June the 26th, 1940, the fraternity associates gave a party for Westrick at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York to celebrate the Nazi victory in France. This was, of course, only appropriate. Fraternity guests at this Scorpion's feast included Dietrich, brother of Hermann Schmitz of General Aniline and Film, James D. Mooney of General Motors, Edsel Ford of the Ford Motor Company, William Weiss of Sterling Products, and Torkild Reber of the Texas Company. These leaders of the fraternity agreed to help in the free trade agreements that would follow a negotiated peace with Germany. J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI determined that Westrick had illegally obtained his driver's license by lying that he had had no infirmities. The purpose was achieved. Walter Winchell, Drew Pearson, and other patriotic columnists blew up Westrick's Nazi connections out of all proportion, and Westrick was asked by German charge d'affaires Hans Thomsen to return to Germany at once. But before he was ordered home, he had gone to see Edsel and Henry Ford at Dearborn on July 11th at the Ford's urgent invitation, conferring with the grand old man and his son on the matter of restricting shipment of important Rolls-Royce motors to a beleaguered Britain that urgently needed them. He also visited with Will Clayton, Jesse Jones's associate in the Department of Commerce, who went with Westrick to see Cordell Hull to plead for protection of German-American trade agreements on behalf of his friends in the Texas cotton industry. Clayton was the chairman of the U.S. Commercial Company, and he helped protect fraternity interests during World War II. Others of Westrick's circle included, interestingly enough, William Donovan, who became head of the OSS on its formation in 1942. Westrick also made significant contacts with good and true friends at Eastman Kodak and Underwood before returning home via Japan and Russia. Bain told Westrick to use Schroeder and the protection of the Gestapo against their enemies in the Nazi government. In return, Bain guaranteed that IT&T would substantially increase its payments to the Gestapo through the circle of friends of the Gestapo. Not only did Bain own all of the German companies of IT&T outright through the war, but he also ran ITT in factories in the neutral companies of Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, and Sweden, which continued to buy, sell, and manufacture for the Axis. Bain and his directors made repeated and persistent efforts to obtain licenses for dealings with the enemy. When Morgenthau refused the licenses, they proceeded anyway. They also exported materials to their subsidiaries in neutral nations producing for the enemy. After Pearl Harbor, the German Army, Navy, and Air Force contracted with IT&T for the manufacture of switchboards, telephones, buoys, alarm gongs, air raid warning devices, radar equipment, and 30,000 fuses per month for artillery shells to be used to kill British and American troops. This was to increase to 50,000 per month by 1944. In addition, IT&T supplied ingredients for the rocket bombs that fell on London, selenium cells for dry rectifiers, high-frequency radio equipment, and fortification and field communication sets. Without this supply of crucial materials, it would have been impossible for the German Air Force to kill American and British troops, for the German Army to fight the Allies in Africa, Italy, France, and Germany, for England to have been bombed, or for Allied ships to have been attacked at sea. Nor would it have been possible without IT&T and its affiliates for the enemy to have kept in contact with Latin American countries at a time when Admiral Raeder of the German Navy contemplated an onslaught on countries south of Panama. It is thus somewhat unsettling to note. The following memorandum. It seems that this is State Department. It seems that International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, which is handling traffic between Latin American countries and access control points with the encouragement or concurrence of the Department of State, desires some assurance that it will not be prosecuted for such activities. It has been suggested that the matter be discussed informally with the Attorney General, and if he agrees, the corporation can be advised that no prosecution is contemplated. The letter was written at a time when IT&T was manufacturing military equipment for the German army in Spain. Well, I'm going to stop there because it's 9 o'clock. But you see, what we're talking about here is something that I think gives a new way to look at world history, and that is that there is this business as usual crowd called the fraternity by Charles Higham, interlocking corporate directorships across all of the warring parties are going to gradually cause all the wealth to go into the corporations and out of the nations and the people that create and earn the wealth. And they don't care if we die in wars while they continue business as usual. This is a new way to look at the situation far more seriously than I think our history books do, in the sense of, hey, you know, this is a monster that we create by allowing these corporations to become people in terms of their rights, to become like gods in terms of their permanent lifespan, and like masters in terms of their control of human life on the planet, which is only getting worse until we stop it. Thanks for being with me tonight.